So I'm just welcoming everybody to our fourth session with Paul Isaac. We are going to be doing more. We're just going to look at some new dates and times. So this session for the first of the month is going to be on autism and education, and it's from Paul's personal perspective. And I think it's so important that we just continue to have these webinars, because right now there's parents asking lots of questions, and I think it's so important that we get the autistic perspective so that it helps us how we can help our children. So Paul, I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So yeah, this is obviously, as Vanessa pointed out, this is going to be from a personal perspective of education, going through the educational system, different elements of information processing challenges that I encountered, and hopefully it will resonate with the people listening. So in the preschool years, that was the late 80s, early 90s. I was born in 86. The information processing challenges that I displayed in infancy, early infancy, were quite complex. I appeared to be deaf and blind. That was from my mother's observation when I was about 6 months old in January 87. She started observing these differences. And the way in which they manifested was the blindisms isn't the fact that I'm literally blind. It was the way in which I navigated the physical environment. So the way in which I looked, signs of visual perceptual challenges, maybe in my case, they were seemingly staring through things, not at. So there's problems with convergence, so convergence of images, using peripheral vision rather than central vision, and also the way in which I was understanding the world was kinesthetic associative. So there was lots of sniffing, licking, tapping, rubbing, all sorts of other ways of navigating the three-dimensional world. The deafisms is effectively a similar thing, but from a different sense. So one of the other things my mum noticed was my hearing. And it's quite ironic that she thought I was deaf, because I wasn't. In fact, some of the challenges I have are to do with hearing too much in terms of inability to filter. But what she was, it was to do with my body language and obviously the way I was displaying what I was and wasn't hearing. However, from a language processing perspective, I was missing large chunks of conscious verbal information. So when I was at preschool, I was about 80% meaning deaf. So I was only getting around 20% meaning from verbal language. I was meaning blind, and also that made me context blind. So it was about 40% meaning. So when you build that up between those two senses, there wasn't a lot of meaning getting through. And that wasn't necessarily, if not at all, it wasn't to do with lack of intelligence. It was to do with these different information processing blockages. I lived in the system of sensing, which is before interpretation. The system of sensing is, in a simplistic way, we're all born from that system. When you are born, your nervous system is naked, and the way your nervous system relates to things, objects, people, is through mergence. So you're merging in and out of people. You haven't got the cladding or the interpretation or the built-up association. You are just merging. It's a system of mergence that some people on the autism spectrum retain, and also people who aren't on the spectrum. I was functionally non-verbal. So what does that mean? I think people get confused by what I mean by functional and functionally. What I'm trying to say is, in terms of my language trajectory, there was obviously speech and language delay, but it transcended into, because of the meaning deafness, because of communication challenges with oral apraxia and forming words. What that meant is that I was using a language which was pattern, theme, and feel language. So to do with associative echolalia. Echolalia is a stage that all children go through. Because of these language processing challenges, I stayed in that developmental sphere much longer. So functionally non-verbal was that I wasn't literally mute. It was the fact that for the people around me, and it's only through context and reference, that I was making sounds initially because of the problems with articulation, and it was communication. It just wasn't translated. It wasn't translatable. And when I did gain functional speech in later infancy, it was that of a 3-year-old. So it was very clipped and felt very alien and very foreign, because what I was doing, I was switching from the pattern, theme, and feel world, where I built up all my systems, and I was translating it into an interpretive format, which was more relatable, but nevertheless, it was very much, when I started speaking interpretively, it felt very stilted, and it was slower. So my speech was more slow in terms of each word. And that was to do with the switching between the different systems. So there was a certain labour in my voice. In terms of what they thought I was, in terms of the behaviour displayed, so this was in the 90s, initially they thought I was attachment disordered, and that is all to do with frames of reference. I wasn't diagnosed until 24, so that was 10 years ago now. I'm 34 now. So that, in a sense, observationally, had an impact on my parents, my mother in particular, and also the kind of social dynamics of school for my parents as much as myself. Because if one person is saying, this is what we think it is, on some sort of subconscious level, I'm sure it affected me as a child going through education. So when we look at language processing, and obviously this is from my own experience, you start off with words which are effectively sounds, it's phonics. And what I was struggling with was I was hearing words which are sounds, and then because I had visual perceptual challenges, I do not have a visual memory. So I can't pictorially reference the sounds into pictures, moving pictures, movies, however you're retrieving them. And that's a condition called aphantasia. So basically what that word means is that I'm not retrieving information. I'm not making, in this context, visual verbal connections, which then means I have an inability to gain the interpretive meaning. So in a learning environment where it was very much to do with word picture association, which was commonplace in primary school and secondary school. So there was this rebuttal of these two different systems that were going on. And what would have helped, because obviously I've got to think about what could have helped if there was blue sky thinking here. What potentially could have helped in terms of me gaining a level of meaning, level of interpretation, was to do more tactile, kinesthetic things. So it could be using objects of reference. and then marrying the objects so I could feel the objects, I could sniff them, touch them, experience them, and then the word associated with the object. So then what I'm building up is my own sense of meaning, the system I've got, as opposed to a system that was there, but I was unable to access. I just want to point out that this wasn't the fault of anyone. It wasn't the fault of the teachers. It wasn't the fault of the system I was in. It was just how the system was at the time. And bearing in mind, I wasn't diagnosed. So when I just want to extrapolate that more, I wasn't even given a statement of special educational needs. There was nothing there from primary to secondary school. So when I think of what could have helped, it's obviously looking back at my profile. So language processing. Then we've got visual perception. And obviously, I'm externalizing to internalize. That is, in essence, what I've done through learning. So my environment, if I couldn't get retrieval from my eyes, or rather the processing, I'd use other aspects, other sensory modulations to gain meaning. And of course, externally, these may have seemed like, to the layman, unusual, strange, bizarre. But if you take a moment to think about my world and the perceptual world, the language-based world, it makes perfect sense that I was using this system to not only gain meaning, but if we put it into an educational framework, to learn and to create associations. And if we think about meaning blindness, being blind to meaning, then you're going to use your body, you're going to use your hands, you're going to use your feet, you're going to use other parts of your sensory system to gain meaning. For example, when I licked something, it was all about texture and taste. Sculpting something was working out the rhythms of depth, the rhythms of detail, but not through my eyes, through my hands. The same with spitting, and phlegm. That's all to do with heightening a surface. Getting a sense of, is the surface rough, is it smooth, etc. Sniffing, again, you're gaining another association. Touching, tapping could be to do with, again, realizing, is it hollow? Has it got depth? What sound does it make? Why does it make a different sound? What are the reasons for this? So as you can see, in a non-visual way, but in a kinesthetic way, how that could have helped, as I gave the examples of the language, how that could have helped in an educational framework was understanding, firstly, that this system was going on. So the fact that there's this system that I, as a child, was displaying and then working with it. In terms of a social context, the way in which I recognise people was an extension of what you're just seeing on the screen. My mother was hair, but it wasn't that I'm seeing or saw hair, it was the texture, the feeling. My dad was face, but it wasn't to do with, again, seeing a face. It was to do with remembering the contours of his face, his nose, his lips, his teeth, his eyes, etc. So you can see how I'm externalizing to internalize. I'm having to go out there and externalize to create not only memories, but association, and memories are to do with association. Object blindness, so I lived in a world of mono. So mono meant one-track systems, not a multi-track system. So without these tints, these glasses, in those days, I would be able to focus on one thing but lose everything else. So if I was in a classroom, I could maybe focus on the words on the blackboard, but not anything else. Or I could focus on the blackboard but not the words, or focus on the teacher but not the board, focus on her hand, you know, not her, or focus on the chalk, not her hand, focus on the classroom, not the people, focus on the people, not the classroom. And what's happening is it's this inability to converge visual information. So as you can imagine, being in a classroom setting, that was very difficult to filter, because you're living in a world of mono. And if one system shuts off, I may not be able to retrieve it. So I think this is where my mum got this idea through observation of blindisms and deafisms. It wasn't the fact that I was literally physically deaf or blind. It was to do with the inability at that point to filter different types of information. And again, what is one's reality? We don't think about this probably enough in any human being. How is the person experiencing through their brain, through their nervous system, what reality actually is? And it's individual to each person, and it can change over time. So again, my sense of reality was through being tactile, being physical, and then through the associative modulations, I was building up a sense of my interpretation of reality, which then, of course, is associated with learning, associated with education in the context which I'm talking. I wasn't necessarily a logical or literal thinker, and I'm still not to some degree. But as you can see, I was patterning my way through these associations. And in primary school and secondary school, to varying different degrees as I got older, being missed meant that I suppose in hindsight wasn't necessarily getting the grades or the educational qualifications that I could have got. However, it was what it was in the time and through the lack of information. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of partly how I access or did access information. So the system of sensing was first coined by Donna Williams in 1998. She'd done a book called The System of Sensing, The Unlost Instinct, where she came to the conclusion that there was a lot of people on the autism spectrum who were not necessarily literal or logical, or may have had a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. There was another system going on in which the person was living before contextual meaning, before interpretation, and they were merging with things. So first aspect of this is pattern, theme, and feel. So you can get some children and adults on the autism spectrum where their language is associated with a pattern, theme, and feel way of expression. So that could be through echolalia, it could be through noises, it could be through gestures, and it's building up this almost unconscious repertoire of different associations with emotional states. And that's very key, because I think in some ways it's about bridge building, the fact that people on the spectrum are emotional beings, and so was I. So when I was watching movies, TV programs, the emotion obviously that I was getting from and the semantics in my own world were being splurted out in this way, and it was very much like my mind was confetti. But bearing in mind, from a learning perspective, you have to understand what this way of interacting, expressing, is coming from, and understand what the meaning is behind the echolalic wording, behind the echolalic sentences, and living through others. So mergence. So mergence is the ability to, because of different information processing blockages, mergence with people. And mergence is very complicated in that sense. As you grow up with this system, you're constantly picking up on different people's subconscious emotional states, and that can be very difficult to unpick. In my case, what was my own emotional states, thoughts, feelings, and what was someone else's. So you imagine being in a room full of people and trying to unpick that 30 children and being pre-literal. So there's this stereotype that all people with autism are literal, and there are people that aren't literal and aren't as literal, because autism is a fruit salad, as Polly would say. And what I want to get out of this is, someone is living in this system. It's important to know how they're living in this system, how it's expressed. Another thing about mergence is mergence can not just be a social emotional thing where you're merging with people and beyond the body language, beyond the cladding, beyond the interpretive frameworks which we build up over time. Children, adults can also merge with objects. I mean, the first object I merged with was a toilet. And I used it as a way of navigating the world in terms of little bookmarks around places. So if you imagine the different toilets represented different places, that may give you an idea of its function. And also I would get addicted to sensory highs. So I would merge with the water. So the flushing of the toilet would mean that you get this gush of water, and then emergence happens where you become one with what you're focused on. So you're unable to detach from that experience. So it's almost like funneling into that singular reality. And this can cause great pain for some people on the spectrum when they're taken out of that mergence. And it could be an object, a picture, a shoe, a light, anything. If you're living in a world before interpretation, you may see an interpreted world. A shoe is for putting your foot in, or a light is for a room when it gets dark outside. But in the world before interpretation, where I live, those things were arbitrary. It could be anything and have any function, not just what people see it as its interpretive function. And I can remember, just to contextualize that further, there's a documentary hopefully coming out soon about Donna. And there's this wonderful scene where she goes into a second-hand shop, and there's telephones all around her, these old-fashioned dial telephones. And she just blurts out, I just want to lick them. So obviously, that gives you an idea of her reality, and it also gives you an idea of the fact that there's this mergence going on with objects. Another example I can give were when I was in year 4, and there was about a 2-litre bottle of water with little pinpricks in it. So when you put the water in, plumes of water would come out, and I would be focused on that for what seemed like forever. Time just was lost when this sense of mergence happened. I can remember walking around a factory with children in about year 7, and it was a textile factory. And for a moment, there was this piece of machinery, and there's a bit of it I was again merging with. And what actually cut me off from this mergence, has actually made me very upset, was 2 women laughing at me, because obviously what happened was I was obviously beginning to merge with whatever I was seeing, and the teachers and the students had left the place. So the laughing took me out of that sense of mergence, and also kind of plucked me back into reality, and I realised I was lost, or at least lost in the way I perceived it. Oh, the people weren't there, rather than getting, panic-stricken and worried. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how that presented itself in me, and how it works. So what does functionally non-verbal mean? I'm going to expand on this, because you have echolalia, but you also have other unconscious ways of picking up nuances. So echopraxia is to do with echoing movements. Echomimia is to do with echoing gesture, body language. I'm sorry, I put echopraxia twice. So echopraxia, echomimia. And one of the shows in which I built up a large repertoire of these stored responses was Power Rangers and Hook, the Robin Williams film. And so patting, theming and feeling from the different words, different gestures, evoke things on an unconscious level from within me. But you can imagine in an educational setting, that was very difficult for other people, other teachers, to translate. Oral apraxia meant that if I did find words, I would struggle to say them. Initially, in the early years, that was true. It's called, oral apraxia is to do with movement, so it's speech organs, and it's common in cerebral palsy. There's obviously a big gap between the internal world versus the external world. So my internal reality and how I'm filtering it through the external world. And then the challenges that come with mentalizing and word finding as a result of that. So even when I became functionally verbal in late infancy and well on into secondary school, this was my system to a point. And what could have helped, I suppose, looking at this slide, was time. So time is all about reflection, effectively, being objective, being inventive. That would have been a great thing for a teacher to actually evoke, is a sense of being inventive with different styles of learning. And also working parallel with my system at that point in time, because what was happening, as I've clearly evoked in the previous slides, is there was this mismatch all the time in the system. The one thing I try to do as I've got older, and particularly been an advocate for 10 years, is to not get angry at systems not being understood. Or to not evoke a non-objective response, because the way in which people learn, and that includes non-autistic folk, is being calm and working with one system. So rather than looking at both systems as being arbitrary and alien, we have far more in common with one another as human beings and not. And actually, Polly Donna Williams said something which was quite profound. In a sense, she said people who aren't on the spectrum can get an idea of what it's like not to be on the spectrum. She said it's called being tired. And when one is tired, I'm speaking to you, the audience, now, to reflect upon this. When one is tired, your senses and your nervous system aren't quick. And if your senses and your nervous systems are quick, you may forget a face, or you may all of a sudden lose words, or you may look at an object but not quite realize what it was or what it is. And if you turn the volume up on those experiences, it's about bridge building here, you can then maybe within yourselves find something relatable to what I'm saying. It's all about degrees and presentation. So primary and secondary school, we're going to look at exposure anxiety, body disconnection, and the associated mental health challenges. And also being reflective, as I have been on some of the slides, on not being diagnosed formally during these educational years. So exposure anxiety I've spoken about, and actually done a workshop for Vanessa last year. And the way in which exposure anxiety affected me was more so when I became functionally verbal. And I believe the reason why this affected my learning is because I was shown effectively more of myself. And exposure anxiety is to do with retaliation, diversion, compulsive responses to when self is made aware of, you create these responses. So I go into echolalic litanies that went nowhere, so they were directionless. Dissociation was common, so dissociating from the classrooms, the people, the places. So dissociation for me was depersonalization, so dissociating from self, and derealization, dissociating from the physical environment around me. And there's a high prevalence of autists that dissociate who have complex language processing challenges, because let's face it, if you're only getting, in my case, about 30% meaning initially, and then that built up over time to 30-40% probably by the end of my tenure at school in education, those pre-attentive gaps where things were going in but not on a conscious level, I would dissociate. Selective mutism is something that I've done also. I hated the sound of my interpretive voice because it didn't flow like the echolalia. It was stilted, it was laboured. So mutism was another way of almost, again, so people wouldn't see me, because once self was made aware of, then these protective responses would happen. And it was effectively impulsive self-sabotage. So I was constantly sabotaging opportunities to show self, and that indirectly also had an impact on socialization, how I socialized, and what I associate socializing with. And also it had an impact on learning, because learning is about being direct, about being out there and being counted for. So if you have exposure anxiety, it can be a very trialing experience. Then we go on to body disconnection. So there's another reason why I dissociated. I wasn't connected with my body as much as other people. And when we think about learning, you can imagine that this can be quite a difficult process to learn if you're not quite in sync with your body. So I was unaware of my body as a whole. So physical education was actually quite good in terms of making me aware of my body, its parts, etc. And one of the things that did actually happen, which was positive at primary school, There was a young man there with cerebral palsy, and we had additional physical education lessons with a tutor. And that actually helped greatly, because what both of me and him could do was actually go at our own pace, and it was tailored towards a much more slower, much more concise pace of learning. So this helped me in terms of being aware of body parts, being aware of pressure, being aware of where I was in the environment, and of course pain. I suppose pain agnosia, in terms of the broader context, was obviously more difficult to manage, because if one was hitting themselves or striking themselves, etc., it may be confusing to the onlooker to know what is the motivation behind that. One of my mum's memories of me doing this was when I was younger, and she was quite concerned. She came into the sitting room and saw me banging my head up and down, up and down, up and down. And of course, what she saw was something that was quite counterintuitive, because when I looked up at her, rather than being in tears or crying, it was actually completely the opposite. I looked at her with apparently with quite a big smile on my face. My theory was that I was getting some sort of feedback which I could understand. So the pressure, the quick, short, sharp pressure on my head was making me aware that I had a head and that it was a part of me. And this element of self-awareness, I think, made me smile rather than be disconcerted. So there are many different origin points to why someone may appear to harm themselves, or I was harming myself, but the context of why I was banging my head was to make myself on some level aware that it was there. So if one is so disconnected from their body, one of the things that I think really helps, they do it with people who acquire strokes and brain injury, is something called brain gym. And that was effectively what was happening in those additional physical educational sessions. It was allowing both of us to build up nervous system and the neural pathways. That's what effectively what brain gym is. And then extended to that home, I was riding a bicycle, around 7 or 8 years old, and that was promoted, and also swimming and walking. So it's, in a way, that really helped with my confidence, and also just basic physical health. But again, it gives you an idea of these different types of information processing challenges. Mental health conditions. So these happen through school. And the binge eating disorder happened in late infancy. And what people don't realise, all human beings have core beliefs. And some of those core beliefs get distorted. And before the age of 7, any child will believe what is said to them in terms of presentation. So how does a binge eating disorder start from a psychological perspective? Well, it starts off with an association. And what was happening, my late grandmother, I used to go round her house, and she would go upstairs and do cleaning, etc. And what would happen, she'd have all this food and it wasn't just the food, it was the amount. But there was the key thing. With the amount of food I was having, 6 packets of crisps, 3 cornettos, what else was I having? Copious amounts of white bread and biscuits. I could have a whole tube of biscuits. But what she was doing on a subconscious level and an interpretive level that was actually passing through me was giving me validation that this is okay. This is good. This is I'm proud of you. This is a good idea. And because that happened before the age of 7, it goes into the core patterns of core belief and then chemical activity in the brain. So binge eating, so I still have problems with binge eating, and it's all to do with coping with low mood. It's a way of me regulating my body emotionally in an unhealthy way. And of course, from an educational perspective, when bullying started, as early as 5 years old in the village I lived, and then it was certainly by the age of 10 to 11, I was being bullied by a teacher at primary school, and then bullying persisted into secondary education. It was used as a crutch. OCD manifested about 12 years old. And it's all to do with dopamine. Similar to the binge eating, dopamine is what gives you that short, sharp hit, that temporary euphoria, whereas serotonin is more elongated. It's to do with a more lengthy process of mood. So these dopamine hits, and on my mother's side, OCD is prevalent. And that started off with hand washing, and this affected my education. So to such a degree that I remember a student actually coming into the bathroom, into the toilet, wondering where I was, because I was counting each time I was going in the bathroom. I was counting at the basin. And I got in my head that if I counted a certain amount of times that I'd have a good day, or that the day would go well. So I was looking for some sort of subconscious control over the external environment. Dissociative disorders were prevalent. I was dissociating so much by secondary school. It was a wonder that I was there, but it was I was there physically, but not in mind, not in conscious mind anyway. A mood disorder, I would say, started around 10 years old, and then that's associated with emotional dysregulation. That has about 60% crossover with autism. So the inability to manage emotional states. And OCD has around a 30% crossover with autism. So a lot of these conditions, you wonder, the chicken and the egg scenario, was it to do with the fact that I had difficulties on their own, or was it also to do with the hereditary factors of some of these difficulties? Or was it to do with a mixture of the two, a nature versus nurture process? I would say the latter. So my reflective thoughts on the education is, as far as I'm concerned, regardless of all the negatives, it introduced me to different people. If I wasn't going to get anything educationally out of education, ironically enough, there's got to be something, and it's to do with human connection. I was in a sink or swim environment from the age of 5. I had no other choice. And I wonder, even though it wasn't the most ideal scenario, I think from a personal perspective, it tempers something called resilience. And resilience is quite an amazing thing for any human being. Resilience builds character, it builds strength in times of great difficulty. So in a sense, being put into situations I may not have been put in if I'd have been diagnosed, did it help? Did it hinder? Maybe looking back, it could have been a mixture of both. So it's almost about getting that balance between support and allowing the person to grow, get a sense of self, identity, autonomy, etc. It gave me a concept of how not to treat people. So bullying, in the most basic sense, is psychological, physical abuse, and then it can also transpire into other more complex areas such as sexual abuse, etc. And what I learned from being bullied was how not to treat people. and how, if you've got that frame of reference within you that you feel you have to treat people in such a way, you probably need more support than I did in that time. So humanizing bullying behavior is objectifying. So understanding that that person's probably very unhappy, may have their own mental health challenges, may have their own information processing challenges. And particularly in teenage years, I think that being a teenager is extremely difficult. And I think a lot of people have, a lot of teenagers have a crises in identity, sexuality, gender, placement in the world. And for some teenagers, it comes out as bullying. And also, I think that we've got to remember that teenagers aren't adults. This is something I think people forget. A teenager biologically and chronologically isn't an adult, yet we put and continue to put a lot upon them. And I think one should allow growth with healthy direction, but understand that being a teenager is biochemically and socially a difficult human phenomena and should be treated with dignity and respect. So understanding forgiveness, one has to forgive. I forgive everyone that's bestowed anything on me because I'm not perfect either. No one's perfect. So frames of reference and gaps in knowledge. That was what was happening. I'm not angry at teachers or bitter at the educational system. It was effectively from, you know, late 80s to early 2000, it was frames of reference or lack thereof and gaps in knowledge. That was effectively what tempered my educational experience. But, and however, one has to take something from it. And to live in the past, I refuse to do. I refuse to do it because it doesn't help the present, and it certainly doesn't help the future. You have to put it in its place, internalize it, conceptualize it, move on. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy feat. It isn't an easy feat, but it's one worth pursuing. So I suppose the books that would help in relation to this presentation is probably my first book, Living Through the Haze, which obviously goes through my life up until the age of 24. And I would say the other book would be Understanding and Supporting Autistic Students in Specialised Schools, because I think those two in particular are most related to the presentation. I thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. We may have time questions, and I'll pass back to Vanessa. Thank you for listening.